Elvis Costello. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? As long as you do it the right way. Allison Cohen is with me. This is the SCOTUS Bowl. They have wrapped up their season, and we are going through all the decisions that are huge and how they will impact you. But Allison, actually, a caller had a question. I think this is a great question. I've actually been meaning to ask you this, and I keep forgetting, which is the Ninth Circuit. You already told us.
Yes.
Ninth Circuit overturned 88% of the time this time around. They are the folks who told President Trump, oh, you can't do this thing. And the Supreme Court has said, well, yeah, he can. We're going to take it up. We're going to lift the stay. Here's the question. Are they youngsters on the ninth, or is Trump going to have a chance to be able to replace what is the most liberal and the most activist court?
Great question, whoever the caller was, and Colossus of Cloud. So there's 43 justices that are sitting on the Ninth Circuit. Let me give you a little bit of the breakdown. 7 of the judges were appointed by Obama. 14 were appointed by Clinton. 7 were appointed by Bush. 4 by Reagan. 2 by Bush Sr. 7 by Carter, and 2 by Nixon.
Yes,
Okay.
we got 2 still hanging on from
still
Nixon
hanging on
days?
there by Nixon.
Oh,
The appointment date was 11/30/71 and
Oh, my
6/28/72. So that would be Judge 2 senior circuit judges, Alfred T. Goodwin and Judge Clifford Wallace.
How old are they? Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, they
They're
weren't
old.
appointed when they
They're
were
old.
20.
Yeah. They wouldn't be, you don't get appointed to the Supreme Court.
Oh,
Because
my
we already know that Gorsuch was the youngest appointee to the Supreme
To
Court.
the Supreme
Yeah.
Court,
So
okay.
they're hanging in. And so if they retire, then we could see Trump be able to appoint 2 judges out there.
That's still 2
yeah.
out of what, 43?
Yeah, 2 out of 43. Again, you've got 14 Clinton appointees, 7 Obama, 7
21
Carter.
right there.
Yeah, 7 Carter.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, the deck is stacked.
Yeah. It is. It is. And so I think part of what we fail to realize is that the president's job in appointing judges, takes place across the entire nation. So we're very focused a lot on the Supreme Court and this idea of putting a supreme, we're here to
Right.
talk about, Team Supreme and go to the Supreme Court, but think about many cases, how many petitions are sent each year. We talk about the 7,000 petitions are filed before the Supreme Court. They only hear 100 to 150 a year.
And that's it.
So the lower court judges are what's really significantly
And those rulings,
important.
if they're not picked up, those rulings stand.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or
You got
not,
it.
they stand.
Right.
All right. What do we got next
All
on
right.
this case?
So let's talk about this case. And you had mentioned it because I don't know whether it was Steve Forney or John Bayback. We were talking about this idea of sexual predators, of those that actually have been convicted of some kind of sex crime.
Oh, access to the internet.
Yes.
And social media.
Social media. So that case was Packingham versus North Carolina. And so essentially what happened was a young man was 21 years old. He had sex with a 13-year-old. He was convicted. He needed to register as a sex offender, which
Yep.
he did. North Carolina had a law that basically said that it is a legitimate interest of ours to protect minors from sexual abuse and not allowing people to go on the internet,
Right.
particularly on these social media websites. That's what they were targeting. And so in 2010, this individual went on his Facebook page and he made the following statement, and I'm quoting, "Man, God is good. How about I got so much favor? They dismissed the ticket." He had just gotten a ticket for speeding. "They dismissed the ticket before court even started. No fine, no court cost, no nothing spent. Praise be to God. Wow. Thanks, Jesus." That was the statement that he made.
That was it.
That was it.
Nothing wrong with that statement. We would all say it
Right.
if we beat a ticket.
If we beat a ticket, I think we'd all say it. The problem
Yeah.
was is that the North Carolina had a law in place that specifically said that we don't want committed sex offenders going on social media sites. But the Supreme Court came back and they said, Supreme Court of the United States said, look, we don't feel that the law is tailored carefully enough. And we're going to look at the First Amendment, principles, and we're going to say that speech in this situation is a speech, was permissible speech, and we're not going to allow that law to stand because it's overreaching. So one of the things the Supreme Court always does is trying to look at a rational basis. It's always measuring laws. Is there a relationship to the law and what it's trying to protect, or is it overreaching? Is it overbroad?
Overreaching
Yeah.
is a word you've
Yes.
used considerably in explaining these things to us.
And so what was great about the case is they really start talking about the idea of social media now, because we're in a whole new place.
Right.
It's no longer speech in the, outside the courthouse or speech in a
Mhm.
public park, right? It's now speech on the internet.
Right.
And how do we govern that and not really impose, our will? That, in other words, impose the law to restrict speech in a way that isn't meaningful. And I think what was interesting is at the end of this case, here's what they said. They said, basically, it's a well-established rule that the government may not suppress lawful speech as the means to suppress unlawful speech.
Wow.
So this was a case in which, if you think about the statement that he made, there was nothing wrong with that statement.
No,
right?
it makes sense with what you just
Right,
said. You
right.
can't, in order to suppress unlawful speech, you can't suppress lawful speech.
Exactly.
You can't cut cleanly through.
Right.
You have to be more selective.
You have to be more selective.
So do you think, they said this was poorly crafted.
Right.
Like Gorsuch said, and we talked about how he said, look, I ruled on the law. That's the law you sent me.
Right.
Do you think they could rewrite this law and make it so that they say, okay, you can't be on social media? Because as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. A guy who's a registered sex offender
Right.
has a right to go to the public square,
Right.
has a right to say, this is what I think about this, that, and the other thing. I'm kind of wondering, maybe they do have a right to go to social media. We can't call up James Madison, who was sitting there in that room writing the Constitution.
Exactly.
We can't say, James, listen, we're going to have this thing called Facebook, and first thing he's going to say is, what is that, a waste of time? Yes, it is, Mr. Madison, we're sorry, but,
Right. Right.
here's what
Right.
here's what we're doing.
Yeah, and so how do we think about that? And so, at first blush, when I heard the ruling, I was a little angry, and I had to read through the opinion because I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this guy is, a committed sex
Right, and
offender.
I'm always-
He's had sex with a 13-year-old,
Lovely,
he's despicable.
lovely, yeah.
Thank God he had to register. This is great. But then when you look at the statement he made, and you realize that that statement is completely separate and apart from anything related to
Mhm.
anything, that he was convicted of. It certainly isn't a solicitation,
No, he
and-
wasn't.
yeah.
He wasn't grooming
Right.
a potential victim. He just put something out there. I beat a ticket, just
Right.
like you and I would say.
Exactly. And
But
so,
we would never get a ticket because we don't break the law.
no, and I think ultimately we have to look again at the First Amendment. What are our rights under the First Amendment, Jim? What is our fundamental principles that we're trying to uphold? And so this idea of free speech, which is one that has been really brought out there with the hate speech and everything that's
Yeah.
going on in the law, we're always measuring, right?
I'm going to be honest with you, Allison. I've really changed my mind on hate speech lately because I have said, it's the Scalia principle, who decides? Hate crime legislation, hate speech legislation. I'm really, as much as how much I hate speech, I know that's a pun, but I think about it and say, well, wait a minute, who decides?
Right.
Some people think the things I say are hate speech when I say I believe in a set of principles where people are self-reliant and that's hate speech.
Right.
Well, who decided that's hate speech?
Right.
So I have a tough time with that, Allison. Your segments have helped me a lot with these things to think them through, even though the average person, even if you're not a legal scholar, they wrote that Constitution so we could understand it.
It's fantastic.
Madison, I've stood in that room in the home, Kathy and I visited it, where he wrote it, and I just looked around and said, wow, that guy sat here with books stacked to the ceiling about ancient Greece and about the Roman Republic and everything else, and he sat there and said, but I gotta make the average person be able to understand this.
Right.
And I know we get into lofty things sometimes, legal issues, but it was so the average person could understand it.
And so it could be applicable to every day, and it still works, Jim. It's still,
definitely.
next to, in my opinion, my humble opinion, next to the Bible, it's the greatest document ever written.
Ever.
I love it.
You find me
Yeah.
a system that's better, I'll go for it. It may not be perfect, but you find me one that's better, I'll go for it.
Exactly.
No, thank you, Karl Marx.
I'm right there with you, buddy. I'm right there
Thank
with
you,
you.
Karl Marx.
I'm right there with you. So, okay, very important, First Amendment case. I agree with it after reading the opinion. I understand why they did what they did, and I'm okay with it.
And you and I don't suffer sexual predators
No.
very well.
No, definitely
We
not.
do not.
We are,
No.
and which is interesting because Scalia, and I'm not saying he suffered sexual predators, but Scalia, was a big proponent for the criminal defendant.
Mhm.
He actually gave the criminal defendant he felt that the Constitution provided that opportunity.
Yeah.
And he gave them every chance to ensure that they had a trial that was, free from prejudice.
Yep.
And if you think about one of the cases that we looked at this year, and this was a case that I didn't really agree with necessarily, but it was the Pina Rodriguez versus Colorado case. Do you remember that case where there was juror and racial remarks being made?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And the court found that there was some kind of, interruption in the proceeding, and they remanded it for further proceedings. Meanwhile, there were other cases that had been where you see people in the jury box back there that they were drinking, that they were
Yes.
they were ingesting drugs, and all of those cases were upheld. But there was a couple of small comments that were made,
Yeah.
and they reversed and sent it back.
Racial
lower court.
comments were
Yeah,
made, right?
right.
And they said this was an unfair trial
Yes.
for this individual
Right.
because those racial comments were made.
So, one of the cases that I didn't agree with. The other cases that we had discussed, another one, the Hernandez versus Macy's. I don't know if you remember, that was the cross-border shooting case.
I do remember
Yes.
that case.
Okay, that came out this week. It was a 6-3 decision. The judgment was vacated. The case was remanded down to the lower court. So they overturned it. And basically what they were trying to figure out in that case is whether or not somebody that lives on the other side of the border,
Yeah.
whether they can
Outside of the United
outside of the
States.
United States, whether they can exercise their rights to bring a lawsuit against folks on the inside of the United States. And in this case, it was the Border Patrol. And so they had a lot of back and forth in terms of the cameras and the evidence, but the case kind of metered out more on procedural grounds because they said, you threw the case out on a motion to dismiss. You haven't let any of the evidence in yet. We want to really see what happened. We want to know whether or not this Border Patrol knew or didn't know that this kid was, part of, that he was actually not a citizen of the United States. So there's
Right.
extra facts here that we want the lower court to look into. So they remanded that case, they sent it back. And so that one's kind of still.
We won't know.
We won't
We
know.
won't know.
We
And
won't.
remember that the whole thing here was, and this bothers me frequently. If you come to this country illegally or if you're crossing the border, are you afforded all the same rights as an individual who
Right.
is a naturalized citizen? And I happen to be of the mindset, no.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't mean I want you tormented and tortured and everything else, but you don't have the same rights. And that's why in this case, you're saying they really didn't get to rule on whether they felt that.
Right.
They pushed it down because there were other parts of the case. You bring it back down there. It could come back, correct?
It absolutely could come back, and it may be very well that the lower court and the jury or the judge find, after listening to the evidence, that there's not enough to sustain it and throw it out. But at this point, they sent that back, so that was a little bit of an interesting case that we were kind of waiting on. Again, 6-3, Gorsuch did take part in the ruling on
Yeah,
that
when
case.
you said 6-3,
Yes.
I know right away,
Right.
and I know what side he was
Yes.
on. Okay, Allison, we got to wrap it up. Unfortunately, we could go on forever and ever with this, and I love our sessions when we have an extended court session,
I know.
in court in session with the lady law. Now, wrap up for me what you think happened this year and what happened going forward. I know you can't go into great detail, but just what you think where we are and where we are going forward now.
I mean, I'm very pleased with the way the court came down on most of the cases this year. I felt it was a very cohesive court, which was unusual, I think, in terms of what people were fearful, Jim.
Yeah.
Scalia passed. Was it going to be 4-4 rulings the entire year? In fact, we got just the opposite. Was he maybe a polarizing, force on the court?
Maybe he
particularly? Well, maybe he was, but ultimately, I think we're in a good position. I am very pleased with the appointment and the confirmation of Gorsuch. We'll see if Kennedy retires anytime soon.
He
80 years
hasn't.
old. Not yet. Some of the inside, lines with some of the law clerks seem to think that it may be very nearly in the future. Ginsburg, 83 years old. God bless her. Is she going to retire? I don't know. Which would put
I
two
would
more
like for her to
Supremes
retire. I
up
wish
there.
her all good health and everything else, but I wish she'd retire. All right.
All right,
Danny's
Ross.
telling me we got to retire for our final segment. I'm going to have a final word for you folks. But before that, my gratitude, my thanks, Allison, for all of this. This is great. I love these segments. And Allison will be live tomorrow at 11 o'clock on WTAG Legalese. And, of course, you can listen with the iHeartRadio app. Allison, God bless you.
God bless
and I
you.
wish you the best for the 4th of July.
You and Kathy, my absolute love and just friendship always.
Thank you. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to the Jim Polito Show, your safe space.
With